friends, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be here with you for today's first session from the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. And this is a high-level session on effectively financing climate adaptation, where we will be exploring country-owned approaches to building resilience and leaving no one behind. My name is Pablo Vieira. I am the Global Director of the NDC Partnership, which is a global coalition of more than 200 members that includes more than 120 countries, both developed and developing, and more than 80 international institutions to create and deliver on ambitious climate action that helps achieve the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Through the partnership, governments identify their NDC implementation priorities and the type of support that is needed to translate them into actionable policies and programs. Based on these requests, the membership offers a tailored package of expertise, technical assistance, and funding. This collaborative response provides developing countries with efficient access to a wide range of resources to adapt to and mitigate climate change and foster a more equitable and sustainable development for everyone. I have kindly been requested by Sweden as the lead organizer of this session to guide you through this very, very important and exciting discussion, which has the main objectives of showcasing key successes in financing effective climate adaptation measures by sharing case studies and good stakeholder examples, highlighting the Busan principles for effective development cooperation and how they can be applied on climate adaptation measures, and how the GPEDC can contribute to addressing existing challenges. And finally, we want to explore how country-led effective adaptation measures can improve access to capital and be better integrated into national and subnational development planning process using a whole of society approach. We will start the session by hearing some opening and welcoming remarks from Honorary Mr. Saber Chowdhury, who is the GPEDC Business Caucus co-chair and member of Parliament from Bangladesh. We will then move into the scene setting by Professor Salimul Haq, who is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. He's joining us virtually. And then he will be followed by a high-level armchair discussion, including a wonderful lineup of knowledgeable and diverse speakers. Finally, we will have the closing remarks by the Swedish State Secretary for International Development Cooperation, Ms. Diana Jansi. We're immensely grateful to have such a wonderful lineup of speakers with us today. And with this, I would like to immediately hand over the floor to Mr. Chowdhury to provide his opening and welcoming remarks on behalf of Bangladesh. Mr. Chowdhury, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you, Paolo, and a very good afternoon. Wonderful to be back in Geneva, and that too in an in-person session. I think we are all enjoying the personal contacts and the networking. So I have the pleasant task of welcoming you all today, but it's also a sobering task because the subject that we have ahead of us has been referred to a number of times by our distinguished VIPs in the inaugural session. The defining challenge of climate change as we see it. And of course, we also talked about the Sustainable Development Goals and how we are behind. Just talking in terms of Asia Pacific so that you have some context to those words, we are not going to achieve the SDGs by 2030 if it is business as usual. It is going to be close to 2065 or perhaps even later. So we really need to roll our sleeves up. That is not meant to discourage us, but to make us all aware of the enormity of the challenge that we face. And of course, we live in a world today where we are responding simultaneously to a number of crises. We are trying to put out fires one after the other. But what I would say is that we do not equate climate change with the other crises that we have. So inaction should not be an excuse when it comes to the issue of climate change. Climate change, after all, is an existential threat. It's about how we survive, to what extent we'll survive. So yes, there are shocks in the system. There are strong economic headwinds. We know there is a possible global recession, but let us be clear. Climate change stands on itself. And the reason why we in Bangladesh have long seen it as an existential crisis is because of the sheer impacts. We are well aware of the intensity and frequency of disasters. We are aware of the rise of sea levels, which is going to displace millions of people, and that too in a country which is one of the most densely populated. We are aware of the irreversible loss of biodiversity. We know how the glacial melt in the Himalayas is going to impact on water stress and food security systems. We know that planetary overshoot and trying to stay within planetary boundaries is also a very, very difficult challenge for all of us. So the devastating impacts of climate change that we witness around the world today, in fact, is happening at a temperature rise of 1.1 degrees Celsius. 1.1 degrees Celsius. You have heard also during COP that we are aspiring still, we are keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal alive. And in the words of the UN Secretary General, this is a road to climate hell. He described the floods in Pakistan as climate carnage, chaos all over the world. So this is, in fact, very, very challenging situation for all of us. And of course, we who are advocates for this, who are urging action, we are turning blue in the face, reminding everyone of the IPCC warning, the code red for human beings. So the code red is there, but the actions are not translating to words, promises are not being kept, and the gap between where we want to be and where we are today is actually widening all the time. Now, one of the most important points that I would like for you to note, and if there's one thing you take away from what I'm saying, it's this. The problem of climate change needs to be solved quicker and faster than the rate at which we are creating it. You can't have a situation where on the one hand, we are trying to promote fossil fuels, and on the other, we are talking about building resilience and adapting. So this is a very, very important fact. And I say this because I know that the funds are available. You know, if you look at the amount of money private equity has put into the energy sector over the last 10 years, it's $1 trillion. And the majority of that has gone into fossil fuels. You look at the largest commercial banks in the world, since the Paris Agreement, they have pumped in $5 trillion for fossil fuels. So how can we be, on the one hand, encouraging emissions, and on the other, talking about adaptation? Because at the end of the day, mitigation is the best form of adaptation. And unless we are able to rein in temperatures, every other discussion that we have in terms of building resilience, in terms of providing funding, is just going to remain talk, and it will never be reflected in any meaningful action. So how effectively we are able to act and respond to the challenge of climate change is a litmus test for development cooperation. Make no mistake about it. And if we can get it right in climate, we can get it right in other areas. But if we can't get it right in climate, well, then we have a very different world to the one that we are living in today. So this is a very, very important point for us to remember. And because of the years of inaction, when it comes to mitigation, we started off, the UNFCCC started off with mitigation. Then we realized it was not happening fast enough, so we needed to cushion people from the impacts of climate change. We talked about adaptation, and now we realize we have not done enough adaptation, so we are firmly in the era of loss and damage. And we are now talking not about millions, we are not talking about billions, we are talking about trillions. So how do we mobilize that? Is it possible for governments on their own to actually mobilize this amount of money? So some of the questions that we look at: how do we de-risk investment? And risk is political, it's economic, it's financial. So how do we de-risk it so that the private sector feels confident enough to be able to come in and invest. This is something which is very important. How we can leverage public-private partnership to tap into the potential of private sector finance. That is another very important part. How can certain sectors, such as agriculture, be prioritized? What about the multilateral development banks? Can they continue to work as they are doing at the moment? Or do they have to reimagine their engagement, their exposure, given the scale of the challenge that confronts us? So these are all very, very burning issues that we have. Because unless we address them, then the whole idea of leaving no one behind is just going to be a concept. It is not going to be realized in reality. So we know that the global challenges require a global fix. And this is where development cooperation is going to be tested much more than it has been in the past. And this is when we have to rise to the occasion. And I leave with one positive example of what we have tried to do in Bangladesh. You know, we talk about adaptation, we talk about building resilience. In Bangladesh, we have tried to go and imagine one step forward, and that is prosperity. So how can you adapt? How can you build resilience and then use that as a springboard for prosperity looking into the future? And we have the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan, which Bangladesh, as one of the climate vulnerable countries, has promoted. Now we know that Ghana is looking at it, LDC countries are looking at it, the Maldives is looking at it, Sri Lanka has launched it, and that provides not just a template, but that provides a specific plan of engagement of the private sector in investment opportunities. So these are some thoughts that I wanted to share with you. As I've said, climate change is the defining challenge of our times, and it's time for us, as well as the private sector, to rise to the occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chowdhury, and you framed it excellently. The challenge is enormous, but there's great opportunities. And this is what this session is about, to learn from each other, to see what are those best practices, what countries are doing to innovate, to try to bring the resources that are necessary for countries to implement, because it's very clear. As we talk about the climate crisis, we're talking about development crisis for the developing countries around the world. So we will now move on to Professor Huck, who is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development and one of the leading global voices on adaptation, resilience, and climate action in least developed countries. Professor Huck is joining us virtually. You can now see him. So, Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this very important event. For not being with you in person, and would love to have been there, but I'm unable to join you. So I'm going to make three sets of remarks, two of them global and national, and then a third, a more localized one, specifically in the context of my country. It's a great pleasure to be speaking after Mr. Sabir Hossain Chaudhry, who is one of our leading parliamentarians and leading the struggle on climate change in Bangladesh. So the first point I'd make is about global finance for adaptation. I'm sure this audience doesn't need reminding that the Paris Agreement included a promise, pledge from the developed countries to provide $100 billion a year starting from 2020 onwards to support the developing countries to tackle climate change, both through mitigation as well as through adaptation. Unfortunately, the 100 billion was not reached in 2020. It still hasn't been reached. And in fact, the amount of funding that was available skewed very highly towards mitigation. 80% of it went for mitigation and only 20% of it went for adaptation, when the vulnerable developing countries had been asking for and demanding at least a 50-50 split, 50 adaptation, 50 mitigation. So one of the positive results we had in COP26 last year in Glasgow was a recognition by the developed countries that that was not right. They promised to correct it by doubling the amount of funding for adaptation very soon. They still haven't reached the doubling figure yet, but Hopefully, they will do that soon. And in Sharm el Sheikh in COP27, we took stock of what was happening. And the positive news is that funding for adaptation has increased, which is a positive side. But then there's a second issue with respect to the funding for adaptation that has been deployed from the global level. And that reflects the findings of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sixth assessment report, where they actually examined the effectiveness of adaptation projects that have been funded from global funds across the developing countries. And they found that only 10% of the adaptation funding actually went to the most vulnerable communities and benefited the most vulnerable communities. And in fact, they found a very significant number of them not only did not benefit the vulnerable communities, but made things worse for them. And they coined the new phrase called maladaptation. So funding for adaptation, far from helping people, actually made things worse for them. And that obviously, this is many different reasons for all of this, but one overarching reason that cuts across all of the different places where they found this is the fact that the projects that were brought forward were very top down. There were international so called quote unquote experts telling the national governments and the local people what they had to do. And they just followed the instructions and they found that it didn't work. And they did not consult the local people, particularly the most vulnerable people, who are the ones who actually suffer the problems and have a very, very good idea of what is needed to help them deal with those problems. In many cases, they're doing it themselves without any external help as best they can. And so, one of the biggest problems with the way in which climate adaptation finance has been deployed has been in this very top down and, as a result, largely ineffective way. And what we want is not more money alone, we want better money. The quality of the funding for adaptation is an equally important issue as the quantity. And in particular, we ensure that the most vulnerable communities for whom this funding is supposed to be addressed are actually going to benefit from it. And this has given rise to a movement within the larger adaptation community, of which I am very much a part, of what we call locally led adaptation. We have developed 8 principles. Many different institutions and organizations signed up to them. And now we are in the process of trying to address those principles to ensure that locally led adaptation is in fact introduced both in the design of adaptation projects, including the voices and views of the local communities, in the implementation, they should also be involved, and finally, even in the monitoring of the results, because they are the arbiters of what is effective and what is not. The donors giving the money are not the arbiters to decide whether money was effective. The recipients of the funds are the arbiters of whether the funding was effective for their purposes or not. And this global growth of the locally led adaptation community of practice and community of research and community of funding is growing very substantially. And I'll mention something that happened just yesterday in Bangladesh, in my country. The Honorable Prime Minister of Bangladesh just opened a new global hub on locally led adaptation in Dhaka as part of the regional center of the Global Center on Adaptation. So Dhaka is hosting the South Asia Regional Center, which is also now become the global hub on locally led adaptation, where the experience of Bangladesh in particular, but South Asia more generally, can be shared with many other countries. And we have a huge amount of experience from NGOs, civil society, academics, mayors of towns, the government, different ministries, Ministry of Local Government, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Planning. Bangladesh has gone up a very, very steep learning curve and has become a global champion on locally led adaptation. And we are very interested in moving up that ladder, sharing our knowledge and experience with others, and inviting others to share their knowledge and experience with us. We have not solved everything, but we have certainly moved up the knowledge ladder in terms of getting everybody involved in this. And the 3 key lessons I'd leave with all of you to consider is, firstly, it requires a whole of society approach, not just the prime minister or the president or the minister of environment putting a plan together. That plan has to be involving all the different parts of government, the whole of government, and in fact, all of society as well, the different stakeholders in society. And Bangladesh has achieved that. Bangladesh has a very much a whole of society approach in tackling climate change because it's an existential threat for us, as Mr. Saber and Chaudhary said. Secondly, it's a learning by doing process. Without doing anything, we're not going to learn. It's not theory to practice. It is practice to theory. We are doing many, many different things. Some are working, some are not. Not everything will work. We need to learn from our mistakes. We must admit mistakes, acknowledge mistakes, learn from mistakes. If we're not making mistakes, we're not learning. So that is a very important part of the learning curve, is admitting mistakes, allowing for mistakes, and learning from mistakes. And the third and most important one is scaling up. Doing pilots are good. We've done many of them, but the challenge now is going from pilots to scaled up geographically across the country, across many countries, and scaled up policy wise from the local to the national to the global. And that is what we are on the cusp of now achieving. And I hope that this meeting will provide ammunition and support for doing that. And from Bangladesh's side, speaking on behalf of the people of Bangladesh, we are very, very interested in collaborating with anyone else who is working in this arena, because climate change is a global problem. Every country is going to have to adapt. Bangladesh has quite a lot of experience, which we are very happy to share with others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. This presentation was very insightful, and of course, your three recommendations are critical. And I want to end with the last one in terms of how we need to scale up. And the only way that we can scale up is really by working together, by cooperating, by collaborating. And as highlighted by Professor Huck, several challenges exist in terms of effectively financing adaptation measures. We at the NDC Partnership have witnessed this firsthand. Since its launch in 2016, the partnership has received more than 4,000 distinct requests from more than 80 developing countries. Nearly 70% of these requests pertain to adaptation, and more than 40% of them are around budgeting and investment specifically. In fact, finance mobilization is the most requested area of support for the NDC partnership. And based on insights from our developing country members, we have identified common challenges and needs, and I'll highlight very quickly 5. First, countries need support to bolster internal capacity to translate high-level plans into actionable adaptation targets, and enabling them, these targets, and turning into investment plans. Second, countries also need support to integrate adaptation priorities into existing government processes and systems to ensure they are reflected in budgeting cycles. This is the importance of linking both development and strong climate action. Third, countries would benefit from consolidating adaptation priorities into one centralized project pipeline, informed by regular strategy cycles that include the NDCs, the long-term strategies, the NAPs, sectoral plans, and development plans. Fourth, we need to work together to enable countries to double down on project development with embedded capacity for project preparation and to engage the private sector. And finally, countries need support to develop strong enabling environments with innovative policies, regulations, and fiscal and financial instruments to increase attractiveness to private sector investors and others. So to respond to these needs, the partnership launched its finance strategy earlier this year that supports policy framework, integration of NDCs into national development plans and budgets, supports NDC investment planning, and the identification and preparation of projects. Mobilizing the adaptation finance needed to achieve transformational change is going to require more than money. To materialize NDCs and NAP goals, we will require aligning processes, simplifying requirements, building in-country capacity, strengthening coordination amongst finance providers, and much more. We need a whole-of-government approach, a whole-of-society approach, and a collaborative approach. So with these needs in mind, let me move now, because we're going to now start our armchair panel discussion. And as I mentioned before, we have a truly outstanding lineup of speakers here with us today. So let me introduce them, and I welcome you to please come up to the stage. First, Professor Tulin Kube, Minister of Finance and Economic Development from Zimbabwe. Minister. Second, Ms. Susan Moorhead, DAC Chair at OECD. Third, we have Mr. Josiah Osborne, who is the Deputy Executive Director at the Pacific Islands Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, PIANGO. And last but not least, we also have Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, who is the Minister of International Cooperation from Egypt, and Mr. Akim Steiner, UNDP's administrator, who are joining us virtually. I'm not sure we can see them. Minister Al-Mashat and Mr. Steiner, it's great to have you both with us. I see. Yes.
I can hear you.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us. So I would like to start with directing the first question to you, Professor Nkube, to get us going. And of course, others are very welcome to join us in the conversation. Raise your hands, and I will give you the floor, because the idea here is to have a dynamic and interactive conversation. When we talk about effectiveness in adaptation financing, we often talk about the challenges surrounding it, which we've already heard are immense. But not so much in terms of the key success factors that can lead us to improve experiences and to advance quicker. So with this background, I would like to ask you, Professor, based on your own experience, what are some key success factors to effective climate adaptation financing from a country-level perspective?
Thank you very much.
I think it's... Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. I think we all recognize the cost of climate damage, about $1.3 trillion or so dollars. These are big numbers, and that we need easily upwards of $200 billion annually to be able to deal with the adaptation finance gap. But I think the first line of response should be from the government itself, domestically. And that's what we've recognized in Zimbabwe, that it is the government that has to lead that financing challenge, and then work with the development partners to coordinate all of that, but government should lead. So what we've done is we've identified the key areas. The first area has been that of water security. So we decided to build 10 dams across the 10 provinces, and a lot more, frankly, but also recognizing that a dam is not just a piece of infrastructure for impounding water, but that's just the beginning. At the end of the day, you have to get that water onto the land via irrigation, and then that's how you create food security. In fact, we've been so successful that this year, for the first time in 50 years, we're food secure in wheat production. While everyone is looking for wheat, we have enough wheat in Zimbabwe. And that's just an example of how well this has worked. So each dam, again, from each dam, you can also produce power. So each of the dams, we have a hydropower project for which we're inviting the private sector, and the returns are very good, all with internal rates of returns of 30% and above. So the private sector has no reason to come on board. So that's just one way. Another way is again through agriculture, we have been giving free inputs and also fertilizer, and using also drought-resistant seed for cotton farmers and so forth, which we're getting from India, but all designed to really climate-proof our agriculture. We've come up with a wonderful system that we think works. So government has to lead by example and lead from the front, and then coordinate everybody else. We have a national coordination policy, a national coordination platform, which I think has come together quite nicely. And we are working, we have got organizations such as, for instance, IFAD, who are funding irrigation schemes, 6,100 hectares that they are funding. Also, we've made use of the IMF SDR resources to fund 18 irrigation schemes. But also we'll be launching going forward a sort of a climate finance facility, working with our infrastructure bank and also the ministry responsible for climate change specifically. So a lot is going on, and really we believe that the government has to lead, but also we need a coordination policy approach overall. But it's also important to embed everything in some kind of national development plan or national development strategy. We have that. We have a national development strategy, and all of this action, what I've talked about, is embedded in that. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And I think you bring very important points in terms of, first of all, looking at opportunities like in the sectors like energy and agriculture, where you can have both mitigation and adaptation co-benefits, and that makes it easier to mobilize finance for that. But the ownership of the government, that's the most important starting point, and you being here is a clear demonstration of that. So thank you for that. Let me move then now to invite Minister Al-Mashat. In the context of Egypt, would you be able to share your perspective on what constitutes effective climate adaptation financing and how we can strengthen those key success factors? Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Professor Haki gave several statistics, which I will not repeat, but there is a lot of disparity when it comes to adaptation finance. Let me highlight a few points. Country ownership was mentioned in more than one way. Extremely important to be able to move forward. Another common factor is that all of us need to think about climate and development as one. We should not see them as mutually exclusive. SDGs remain to be the common denominator. SDG 13, climate action, is there. And if we entrench different climate projects within strategies that also push development, I think governments win, private sector wins, and the global goals win as well. In the case of Egypt, and we hosted COP27, adaptation and resilience was very vivid on the agenda. Very important discussions took place, and of course on loss and damage as well, for the first time coming out with a sort of an agreement on a trust fund for loss and damage. So if we are able to mobilize finance for adaptation projects, hopefully we do not move into the next stage, which is loss and damage. Nationally, being very much believing in the SDGs, in the development goals, and climate action as well, we have our green transition plans. We also launched our 2050 climate strategy. Within that climate strategy, we were very clear that each of the projects, how they integrate with the SDGs. We took a subset of these projects, some mitigation and some adaptation, and created our own country platform for the nexus of water, food, and energy, NWFE, NWFE, and it's pronounced in Arabic, or means in Arabic, fulfilling pledges. So we wanted to show practically how we can mobilize the international community to create a platform for technical advisory, for concessional finance, all of this to mobilize private sector investments in adaptation projects, food, water, and also its link to renewable energy. We've been done very well with this, with the platform so far. And the reason why is because these projects have been homegrown. They are part of where we want to see the country going. These projects are not just climate projects, but they are development in essence, and hence stakeholders are involved. They are in local communities, so you have it in Delta, in Upper Egypt, close to the Mediterranean, and they address very important national objectives, which also contribute to the global objectives. Let me also say that in preparation for COP, we put together a guidebook, Sharm el-Sheikh guidebook for just financing. And in the guidebook, I know that in the opening remarks from the parliamentarian from Bangladesh, he mentioned many questions. How can we do this? How can we arrive to implementing or mobilizing the 100 billion, etc.? What we try to do in the guidebook is actually show, this is what needs to be done to see this how. For example, governments need to be very clear with their policies and try and also do structural change to create these implementable projects. Private sector MDBs need to also come forward with concessionality, and the private sector as well, seeing these opportunities could come in. We also have on adaptation in the guidebook ideas for a resilience credits. We know that there are carbon credits in mitigation projects. Now we're discussing with IFAD how we can have resilience credits, very important when talking about the adaptation space. And also there's a focus on what some successful examples that African Development Bank has done and IFAD have done in countries that have moved into adaptation projects through climate finance. There needs to be an integrated approach. Countries today are finding it very difficult to finance in general, and therefore integrating climate finance with development finance in a very transparent way to have all the stakeholders together on the table. But this has to be, as I mentioned, and I underscored this very effectively, country-led, because that's the only way there's going to be sustainability in the implementation of these projects. I'll stop here and look at the rest. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Minister. And first of all, congratulations on a very successful COP. One of those outcomes is this guidebook that allows countries to better understand how to take a comprehensive approach to mobilizing finance. So congratulations on that also. Let me move on to Mr. Steiner. Based on the work that UNDP is doing around the world and your extensive experience in the field, what would you see as some key success factors for effective climate adaptation financing at the country level?
Thank you very much, Pedro. A pleasure to join you for this panel and listening to the speakers who have already spoken. I think where we are today is really a very steep learning curve. On the one hand, I think Salim Al-Haq spoke about it. We are, I think, in a world where, especially when you're a sustainable development organization, adaptation in one sense comes naturally to the portfolio. UNDP for many years now has a 50-50 ratio between mitigation and adaptation. But let me also note that the more adaptation investments we have to make, the less money a country has available to invest in actually developing its infrastructure, its schools, its health systems. So the longer we take in many respects to act on climate change, the more steep the curve will be on adaptation expenditure. And I think this is something that we do need to take into account. And part of the lesson that we, I think, have learned with so many countries is that designing an adaptation strategy into, as Minister Al-Mashad just mentioned, national development strategies, but also national infrastructure, national health, and, for example, electricity and power generating infrastructure, roads, railways. These are ways in which we can, at least in terms of a more resilient infrastructure, perhaps be able to bend the curve. So a great deal of our attention. And, you know, at the beginning, when you spoke about the NDC partnership, you laid out a number of the tracks that need to be addressed by countries that we as part of the partnership also address through the climate promise in UNDP. A great deal of that, however, does not yet rise to the reality that when you are a country like Pakistan, when you are a small island developing state, suddenly adaptation takes on an entirely different meaning because you've just lived through an absolute trauma. The floods in Pakistan, the hurricanes, the typhoons, the extreme weather events, the droughts, these are increasingly repetitive phenomena causing extraordinary damage to the economy. So I think in the way that we look at the financing, and Mr. Chowdhury also alluded to it at the beginning, Mr. Ngube spoke about it just now in Zimbabwe, so far much of the financing for adaptation is coming really out of the public budget. And I think we do very quickly have to find through incentives, regulatory frameworks, ways in which any actor in the economy makes adaptation an integral part of their investment strategy. It's the only way that we can leverage the kind of financing domestically initially that will be needed to be able to put the kinds of measures in place. In UNDP, we have looked at our portfolio where we assist so many countries, over 140 right now. The leveraging factor at the moment, you know, $1 spent and leveraging is about 2.5. We need to get to about 10 to actually reach the kind of financing that I think we're all very conscious of. Let me also say a couple of words about broadening the array of instruments, and I'll end with that in terms of lessons learned. I think we are also in a position where we have to recognize that the extreme nature of these catastrophes will increasingly impose on countries, communities, farming households, a price that is extraordinarily high. Insurance becomes more critical. We need to build that into the system. And the loss and damage discussions and the facility that was adopted in principle in Sharm el-Sheikh will be another way in which we can at least step up as an international community to also assist in those moments. But I'll perhaps come back later with some more lessons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steiner. And I would like to highlight that together with UNDP and the GCF and under the mandate of the Secretary General of the United Nations, we're all working together on the Adaptation Pipeline Accelerator, which is exactly focused on supporting countries through this, lessons learned through this, best practices, better mobilized finance for adaptation. So thank you for that. Let's move on to the next question. How can all of us work together across stakeholder groups to strengthen those success factors with reference to the principles of country ownership, transparency, mutual accountability, result focus, and inclusive partnerships? And I would like to start here with Mr. Osborne. Maybe you can share a bit your experience and perspectives from the Pacific region, please.
Your Excellencies, dignitaries, and special acknowledgements to my Pacific leaders who are in the room. I stand here on behalf of Pacific CSOs as well as the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness. In terms of working together for ensuring the success factors that you've highlighted, as civil society, we are development actors in our own right according to Busan, and we recognize the leadership of government at all times during any disaster or for climate adaptation. But allow me to tell you a story which speaks about working together in the Pacific. In December 2020, the tropical cyclone Yasa made landfall in Fiji and devastated communities in the northern parts of Fiji. So one of those communities was called Dongea. This was all flooded. It was really flooded up to a level that the flooding took away most of the houses. And this was one of the extreme cases of flooding. So from then on, the communities itself, they identified because we live in villages where there are traditional clans. So each of the clans, they identify where the land is for them to be relocated. And they managed to negotiate with government, have dialogues with government, as well as with our CSO partners in Fiji, which is a national umbrella platform that is mandated by government to coordinate civil societies in Fiji during disasters. As a result of this ongoing dialogue, where the communities themselves identify what are their priorities in order to move, to relocate to a safer place. So last month, one of our CSO donors from Germany, the Bread for the World, with the support of the German government, have agreed in principle to support the first ever community-led relocation in Fiji. And I must say that when we talk about country ownership, it's about community ownership. It needs to be centered in the people that we are trying to address their needs. And it must be grounded on their needs. As we talk about success factors about working together, the case of Dongea village in Bua, it speaks about providing of enabling environment for civil society and for community groups to have dialogue with government to ensure that their needs are amplified, whilst also to support them in the work that they do. It also, when we talk about community ownership as well, which is when we talk about community ownership on climate finance for adaptation, it will ensure that the financing is effective, it's transparent, and it's results focused, since this is based on the needs from the ground. And we would like to thank donors for their faith, because it shows that in terms of this inclusive partnership, it shows the trust that we have just heard in the earlier sessions, the trust by donors to take that risk to invest in local systems that will ensure that they build their own resilience. And that's something that I know that we are all aware about the climate financing at the national level for the Pacific. Some of our Pacific Island countries are still yet to have taking time. It takes a lot of time for them to be accredited to the various facilities that you have. But to have those donors take that risk in order to support communities, that is one step that we need to take. And it's built on inclusive partnership between government and civil society and communities. It's based on trust, and as you are all aware, in the Pacific, we nearly know each other and we are nearly related to one another. So when we talk about trust, it's about building relationships, and I think this donor has been there for the Pacific for a long time, and they've also understand the context that we live in to have that. It's about inclusive partnership, having a formal engagement mechanism with CSOs, and I believe that we need to be intentional in terms of our engagement with CSOs by government, by other donors as well, to take that risk. At the regional level, I acknowledge that we have our regional bodies that are here. We have our framework for resilient development in the Pacific, which under that framework, we have the Pacific Resilience Partnership Task Force, which includes development partners, governments, and CSOs sitting together as actors that will take the partnership forward in order to build climate, not only adaptation, mitigation, but to build resilience in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned important terms, trust, ownership, partnerships. Those are fundamental, but I think the most important there is to understand that action, especially around adaptation, needs to happen on the ground, and that needs to be done by empowering the communities, because those are the ones that will not only suffer the consequences, but will have the solutions on the ground for the particular situation. So thank you for that. And let me move on to Ms. Moorhead. Based on your valuable knowledge and the views on this topic, considering your unique role as chair of DAC, and your vast experience as an ambassador, a diplomat working across the world and with numerous international organizations, it would be great to hear from you what you feel are the steps that we need to move forward in terms of collaboration and working together to drive the implementation of these best practices. I think they do it from...
I think one of the good things so far is that there is actually a remarkable degree of consensus now about what the problems are and what needs to be done. And I don't think that was the case even 5 years ago. And what all the very esteemed and interesting speakers have talked about is bringing the principles of development cooperation front and center into climate action. Of course we need to do that. You know, we're here at this GPEDC summit. These principles are not nice to haves. We know that development doesn't work without them. And what we've heard is that climate action doesn't work without them either. And, you know, for reasons that I think we're all familiar with, when we collectively or individually were setting up some of the climate architecture, we parked these principles at the door and went inside. But we know it has to be country-led, it has to be whole of society, it has to be transparent. You know, there has to be country ownerships, it has to be based on partnership. So it feels to me as if there's already some progress made, that nobody is disputing this anymore. So what do we have to do about it? What is missing, in my view, is a sufficient sense of urgency at a political level. When we think about what happens in acute humanitarian crises, we move into a different mode. We take more risks. We're prepared to make mistakes and have failure. We're prepared to mobilize phenomenal resources that are available. Think of COVID. It can be done. But at the moment, there is still a sense that there's so much else on our plate that we can kick this down the road for another 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and we can't. So just from the point of view of the Development Assistance Committee, in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow, we agreed a declaration that committed us to aligning all our official development assistance with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, you could argue that to do that in 2021 was a bit late, actually, but better late than never. It's already having an impact. DAC donors are spending more now, actually, on adaptation than on mitigation. And there's a real recognition of what our friend from the Pacific was saying, which is, I mean, there's no development without climate action. You can't separate these anymore. So I think, you know, for our part, we are working hard on the transparency, I mean, as the custodians of the ODA data, so that you can actually see what's going where, so that it's not greenwashing what the real financing is. We know we need more resource. We know actually meeting the 100 billion would be a start, but it's only a start because we're going to need an awful lot more than that. We know that partner countries don't want to substitute development finance and climate finance. We know that the private sector can do far, far more and that they need to be ready to take risks. So I think it's, to be honest, a call to action, and particularly a call to action of the development and the green climate finance institutions to really get the money out of the door far faster than is happening at the moment. I mean, some Pacific islands have to wait 3 years to collect the data to be able to apply for adaptation finance. That is a disgrace in 2022. And collectively, as shareholders, as partners, we need to put a stop to that and say, this is an emergency, let's move on to an emergency footing.
Thank you very much. And you're absolutely right in terms of the urgency and needing to move away from business as usual. And we have demonstrated very recently that it was possible through the COVID crisis. So I want to come to this same question to you, Minister Ncube, because you also have a great background as chief economist and vice president of the African Development Bank, and know the multilateral development banks have been a big part of the conversation lately in terms of what needs to happen and with other stakeholders and funds like the GCF. So what are your thoughts on this?
First of all, multilateral development banks have also mainstream climate response programs in all their development programs. They have to be at the table when it comes to coordination with other partners, including the governments. They really have to be a part of that. And I think that they also have just to scale up resources towards the right infrastructure for climate response. But I'm pleased to say that for the African Development Bank, they have a full program on irrigation development, on just a response to the agricultural sector, to build resilience in that sector, as well as to ensure food security, but deal with climate change in the process. I know, for example, they have a successful pilot program in Ethiopia, where we have seen the impact of that program in wheat production. Oh, well, they didn't give us money in Zimbabwe. I would have gladly taken the money for our wheat production program. We financed it ourselves, but they did a great job in Ethiopia. So they have to be part of that conversation, financing, coordination. For example, in Zimbabwe, we have got the coordination platform, as I said earlier, with all the development partners, and we have got a system for tracking, the impact of what we're trying to do, progress, what we're trying to do. We've got an information system called the Dev Promise. It's just an acronym. I can't remember the full thing, but Dev Promise is easier to remember. So every partner contributes to that. They can download that, they track that, and development banks have to be a part of it. One area where they could also support is in the area of providing guarantees for especially in the energy space, for solar investments in the solar sector, because investors in that sector, the IPPs, are looking for three things. They're looking for a guaranteed decent tariff. Often it's a tariff of the order of 9 cents per kilowatt hour. They also want guarantees on currency convertibility. They borrow from wherever and invest, and they want to take their money out. And third, they're looking for a government guarantee on the power purchase agreement, the PPA. So where the development banks could come in is basically to substitute a government on the guarantees for PPA, but also assist government when it comes to currency convertibility. Now, that's one area, in my view, where everyone will win, and that's a commercial deal. This is not charity, that's commerce, and they can charge a proper insurance fee for the provision of those kind of guarantees. Let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much, and that's very clear. And we also heard from others about risk management for effective investments, and guarantees are fundamental. Of course, countries need to do their role in terms of their own enabling environments, but there needs to be the role of MDBs and others in terms of taking on part of that risk through blended finance and other mechanisms. So. To close this second round of questions, let me go to Mr. Steiner, as you might have additional points regarding this topic on how we can work across stakeholder groups to strengthen the success factors that have been outlined here today.
Perhaps briefly, just to come back to two aspects that I think are critically important. One was what Salim Al-Haq and others were alluding to, how do we make the learning curve not a top-down learning curve? Certainly an organization like UNDP would absolutely recognize the centrality of involving communities, stakeholders in the design. The challenge has been that both within the business of government at a federal or national level, adaptation was until recently a relatively new concept. It was one that also in the donor community essentially received less attention. So the first learning curve was, and I think that's where the NDCs have been a very important part of the journey, elevating within national attention, first of all, the importance of adaptation and designing it into it. Secondly, for national ministries, but also for partners in the international community to co-design the kind of adaptation responses. And I think this is not where the domain of local is exclusive or the domain of global is exclusive. I think it is combining these because we need the latest science, for example, on ecosystem restoration. We need the economics on watersheds, for instance, or on replanting of mangroves, as we need to also look at the economics of investment, for example, on putting new infrastructure in place, the drainage capacity that comes with extreme weather events. I mean, there is a whole new arena of practice that had to be developed from a national planning point of view, but also involving communities. The second one really is with the financial world. We have extraordinary requirements here. One may be still in the public finance and international cooperation domain. For example, the fact that so many SIDS in extreme circumstances do not qualify for any financing, yet are at the forefront of sometimes having these extreme losses, points to the fact that we need a new multidimensional vulnerability index. It's a discussion that has been ongoing for years and should finally be taken to conclusion. But we also need to look at financial markets. UNDP in the last 4 years has developed a sustainable finance hub, in part to help governments better design the kind of capital that they need to raise, including through, for example, bonds. Uruguay recently, with a sustainability performance-linked bond, raised $1.5 billion, tied directly in terms of its interest rate payments as to whether they achieve their goals, in which case the interest rates will drop, or if they don't achieve their goals, deforestation and carbon emissions being the two key examples, the interest rate would actually increase. Suddenly the Ministry of Finance becomes an absolutely central stakeholder in the performance on climate implementation in terms of the NDCs. So I could give you more examples, but I know you're pressed for time. So let me simply say that the way we look at financial markets, that we look also at the insurance and risk finance domain, these are integral parts of enabling countries to rise up to the level of capacity and feasibility of investments that are needed in the years to come.
Thank you very much. I think that's very clear, and with this we close the second round. We'll go to the last one, and I'll ask you to please be brief. But now it's time to get GPEDC to work, not to set the direction in terms of what needs to be done to move this topic forward. So if we can look at how to take this discussion forward and for GPEDC to contribute to align the Paris Agreement and associated climate finance mechanisms with the principles of effective development cooperation at all levels. So I would like to start first with you, Minister Al-Mashat. What ideas do you have in terms of how we can align this and use the incredible resources that we have with us?
I think what is extremely important is the continued commitment from countries, commitment to move ahead with climate action and development. We are having this discussion, but the global backdrop is a very tough one. Financing costs are at all-time highs. Nobody knows when the tightening cycle will end. Prices are high in all countries, developed and developing. In developing, it's more disproportionate. But there is a situation that is more complicated than 2020 and 2021. And this creates, even if a Ministry of Finance today wants to do a green bond, where is the appetite to be able to move that forward fast, as it was maybe just 11 months ago? So there is a global backdrop which is not conducive. It's extremely tough. So renewed commitment is very, very important, and trying to also with the international financial institutions and development partners think together on how to smoothen out some of the because in order to move ahead with the projects, move ahead with the adaptation, to move ahead with the NDCs, you need the financing. Financing be it from the budget, which is coming under pressure, or coming from the IFIs, which again are going through a lot of discussions on how much more they can provide given some of the innovative ideas that came out of COP and before that in the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. So there's an ongoing discussion that needs to also be taken into account. The other is clarity with what countries want to do. So they're committed to moving ahead, but we need to have also clarity. And with clarity, here comes transparency. So when the stakeholders are on the table, everybody knows that we are committed to this, but also we're very clear. These are our challenges. This is how much we can provide, and this is how much we need. Everybody knows that there's going to be a slowdown going forward. So how are we going to pace out the actions and be clear about it? And the third, and this was mentioned more than once, the trust. I'll put it in economic terms, the credibility. We need to continue to try and build credibility and not take the global situation that we have now as a way that pushes the concept or the perception that countries are moving away from their commitments or they are losing credibility. So there's a very it's a very tough balance, and all of us want to move ahead and all of us want to move forward, but at the same time we cannot ignore the new realities that have just come to the table. So this requires more international cooperation. It requires more dialogue and effective dialogue, and that's why the GEPC is a very good framework to do that. Also, many of these challenges create commonalities between countries, and irrespective of what development level they are at. So I think more dialogue in order to emphasize the commitments, try and be more clear with what's happening, and try and not lose the credibility among the stakeholders. Because this is also, if this takes place, then we are going backwards many years. And again, it's nobody's fault particularly, but it's where we are. So we're not going to sit down and assess what went wrong. It's just there's a reality on our hand, and we need to try and work together to see the best outcome for the citizens in each and every country, and therefore the citizens of the world.
Thank you very much. And again, I think it's going back to the principles of effective development cooperation and promoting that conversation, that dialogue to move things forward. So from the perspective of civil society, Mr. Osborne, what are your recommendations?
Thank you. I also agree with the Honorable Minister from Egypt. There's a need for renewed commitment. As we do not have to reinvent the wheel, because already in 2008, the UNFCCC already has, there's already a guidance on climate finance effectiveness. So I believe that there's a need for more alignment without that. Climate finance effectiveness is something that we need, and it is also aligned to what we are advocating for here in terms of all the principles for development effectiveness or effective development corporations. The only thing I would like to contribute is that there's a need to also have new collective quantified goal on climate finance to address climate adaptation, loss and damage. I'm aware that at COP27 we have a loss and damage finance facility, but there's a need to ensure that CSOs are part of the process, similar to the GPEDC, where you have CPDE as a global CSO platform. There might be a need in terms of the loss and damage facility to have a CSO task force to be part of the global loss and damage facility to ensure that our voices are part of the ground. And also, I'd like to reiterate that we need to act now. It is really urgent that we act now. For us in the Pacific, there are communities, because of budget constraints, their adaptation, they would like to have seawalls and stuff to be built, but there are budget constraints in Kiribati, where we are working in our projects, and in some other countries. So we need to act now, because these are people that are really vulnerable. And we owe it to our young people. We owe it to our children and our future generations. So the time to act is now. #ActNow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Definitely, that's the most important thing. Finally, let me invite Ms. Moorhead. It would be great to hear from you. What are those views in terms of what GPECD should do to take this forward beyond this very interesting discussion today?
So I think in many ways it's, as Mr. Osborne said, it's plugging the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And we have made these commitments historically, and I wonder whether with the new loss and damage fund that was announced in Sharm el-Sheikh, we couldn't actually do it better this time, that we couldn't actually set up a fund that was easy to access, quick dispersing, a 2-page application form that got to Kiribati in time, without needing 3 years of data collection, and to improve, I think it was Professor Hook said, to improve the quality as well as the quantity of finance. And then to go back to the rest of this fantastically old-fashioned, complex climate finance architecture and sort it out. So when we all leave here, you know, as shareholders, as members, as governments, as CSO representatives, insist that these institutions work better and use the resources we do have, make them go further and make them work harder. We've talked about, you know, sweating the balance sheets of the development banks. We've talked about innovative financing. There's lots that can be done, but we just need to crack on and do it now because it is urgent.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for your contributions. I think that your point in terms of what do we do about the climate finance and the architecture, I think the point is that we can't adapt existing frameworks to solve the climate issue. We need to start from zero in many senses. We need to innovate. We need to change the way things are. We need to move away from business as usual. And for that, it's very important to be inclusive, to make sure that we're leaving no one behind. And through this, bring all relevant stakeholders' perspectives to be taken into account. And for this, we would now like to open the floor for some questions and interventions from the audience so that we can have a more inclusive exercise. Thank you all for your interventions, but you might be put on the spot now from some of the audience. So we have a number of people who have already requested it to intervene and have shared their questions through the virtual system. So let me welcome up Ms. Estherine Fotabong, who is the Director of Program Implementation and Coordination at New Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, to provide your reflections and questions to the panel. If you could please join us in the podium, that would be great. Thank you so much. How are we doing on time?
Good afternoon. Let me acknowledge the panelists and thank them for the very rich discussions that we have just had. And let me also say all protocol observed to all the excellencies that are in the room and to all the other stakeholders. So I'm coming from African Union Development Agency, and we are a member of the steering committee of GCD. The discussion the panel just had is really exciting and important for the African continent. We just came from Glasgow. Sorry, not Glasgow, from Sharm el-Sheikh. and my High Excellency, I'm sorry for that. We did have an excellent time in Sharm el-Sheikh, and progress was made for the African continent with regard to the loss and damage. This is 2 minutes, it's a short time for this very important discussion. But on reflection, I think a number of things have already been said, and I will just follow Mr. Osborne to say #action_now. And we need action in a number of areas. Obviously, we are calling as Africans for increased flows on climate financing, particularly to adaptation, and we are glad that in Sharm el-Sheikh in Glasgow we did have commitment on that. So we want increased flow increasing efficiency in the use of climate financing, and increase to see more impact on the funding that is currently available. Obviously, with all the statistics that I've given before, this is not enough. We have an annual estimate of about $11.4 billion, but we do know that by 2030 we need about $125 billion to go to adaptation financing. We are nowhere near there, so a lot still needs to be done. So more financing is important, but beyond the financing, we also need capacity for accessing that financing. I'm speaking from an African perspective. We do know that the capacity to develop bankable programs needs to be strengthened. So project development facility is somewhere that we need to see more investment being driven into. And I really want to echo what the sister from DIAC just said, that the financing architecture right now just doesn't work for the African continent. And a lot needs to be done to try and make it more accessible. Information flows need to be there. Most countries do not even know where to start looking for information on where to access this financing. So we at AUD and NEPAD, we're really hoping and working towards putting a climate center with information technology. Lastly, we of course want to see more capacity in terms of planning at all levels. We think it's important not to take a cookie-cutter approach when we talk about adaptation, because spaces are different and approaches and solutions need to be addressed to those spaces. So I will just as my reflection, but the question really to Madam Moorhead, the DAG chair, is what practical support can the development partners, especially OECD DAG, provide to African countries to identify climate adaptation financing requirements and effectively mobilize resources, including innovative mechanisms such as green bonds and carbon markets? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Moorhead?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I mean, I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But I mean, the DAC members are already doing a lot. We provided over 80% of the recent IDA replenishment that, as you know, is doing a huge amount. We finance, obviously, the African Development Bank. And then bilaterally, as I said, we have made this joint commitment to ensure that all our official development assistance supports the Agreement of Paris. So it's work in progress. Our secretariat, and we have a policy network called Environet, and I know the chair is here, so I can introduce you. Actually, almost sitting next to you. And what we try and do is to provide practical guidance to donors and partners about how to do this better and how to access finance, and then to share lessons of what works and what doesn't. So I'm going to join you up afterwards. But I think a lot of this, and it was what I think His Excellency from Bangladesh said, is we do know quite a lot, but we're not sharing it enough. Critically, we know what doesn't work. We have got some ideas on better development and climate action finance. We just need to accelerate it. Hashtag action now. So it's not all bad. And I think you often come away from these conversations about climate change just thinking this is so overwhelming that let's do something easier. Let's not sort of go down this tunnel because it's just too difficult. But it's not too difficult. There's a lot of really good, positive things that are happening, and I just think we need to get better at disseminating them and getting more resource into actually making it work on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Moorhead, and thank you for the question. Let me move to Mr. Julius Caignet. Please, if you could join us. He's the Vice President of the Federation of Free Workers of the Philippines.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, climate financing should not forget about our most important resource, our human resources, our workers. Trade unions consider that the best way to contribute to climate adaptation in line with the development effectiveness principles is through a just transition. In protecting those whose jobs, incomes, and livelihoods are at risk because of the impact of climate change and climate policies or lack thereof, and securing the future of workers and their families and their livelihoods in the transition to a low carbon economy. A just transition refers to a wide-ranging strategy based on social dialogue between and among workers and their unions, employers, government, and communities to provide and guarantee decent climate-friendly jobs, social protection, training and reskilling opportunities, and greater job security for workers and communities affected by global warming and climate change policies. The Just Transition Agenda is an agenda for change in favor of the decarbonization of the economy, committed to achieving a sustainable, resilient, and inclusive society that eradicates poverty, inequality, and hunger, and guarantees decent work. It aims to ensure that the impacts on the most vulnerable populations and regions are anticipated and managed in a fair and concerted manner while maximizing the opportunities for socioeconomic transformation. A just transition is therefore strongly relevant for the work of the Global Partnership on Climate Adaptation. In my country, the Philippines, for example, mine closures have been accompanied by initial attempts at just transition measures, adopting a capacity-building approach with social dialogue and tripartism at the heart of the process. Many years in the works now, trade unions are lobbying for the establishment of the Mining Industry Tripartite Council at the national and local levels as a tripartite cooperation mechanism which provides guidance in terms of just transition policies and programming while promising the absence of a law on just transition could set our gains back if those in power are not climate friendly. My question, therefore, it has been almost 5 years since the adoption of the Solidarity and Just Transition Silesia Declaration. But how many states and development partners have taken guidance from it? My question is, how could GPEDC stakeholders work together to ensure that the objectives of just transition are realized at the country level? How could we ensure that we can effectively use social dialogue where workers through their trade unions have a voice in the process of establishing just transition measures? Hashtag just transition and hashtag social dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Who are you? Anything you want to answer the question or?
Yeah, anyone from the panel?
Okay.
Anyone or two?
Anyone or two? So thank you. Any one of our panelists wants to jump into this question?
If nobody else wants to jump in, may I offer a couple of words?
Thank you, Mr. Steiner.
First of all, thank you for raising this point. I think ever since COP24, when that notion of just transition and the principle of just transition that were just referred to, that were actually developed under the tripartite umbrella of the ILO, arrived in the official climate discourse, I think we have seen a great deal of attention being given to not just the energy transition, the technological challenges, the economic and financing and the environmental issues, but I think increasingly the social acceptance, but also the trust that citizens will have that these transitions do not come at the expense of some, while others may be the beneficiaries of it. And I think this lack of trust has become for many governments increasingly an issue of concern, because the disruption that is implied to establish power production systems, to establish energy economies, industries, transport industries, I think clearly carries with it a great deal of uncertainty and concern about the future. I think in some respects, we have seen through the work that countries have done in their NDCs that the comment is in fact right. Many countries do not yet give this enough explicit attention. Our last count is at about 46 of the 150 plus NDCs currently have an explicit component that looks at, for example, how to contribute to green jobs transition. Where are the net employment gains going to come from rather than the specter of net employment losses? We have also seen more recently new discussions emerge since Glasgow around just energy transition partnerships. South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam are currently engaged in a particular negotiation with a set of international partners to mobilize financing to enable them to exit coal-fired generating infrastructure more quickly. And a lot of the discussion in South Africa has centered precisely around how to design that exit from dependence on high-emitting, carbon-emitting fossil fuel sources with communities, with local economies also at the center of it. So I think a lot more attention is needed here because this will also strengthen the support and the confidence of citizens in this. And therefore, I just want to very much underline the comments that were just made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just in the interest of time, I'll take one more. You want to come in, Minister? No. But if others that don't have a chance to ask a question, please use the virtual platform, and we can take note of your questions and come back to you with the answers. But let me invite Mr. Benjamin Belgi, who is the Executive Director of WINGS, which is a global network of philanthropy organizations. So please, if you can take the floor.
Thank you very much for these important reflections, and thanks for inviting me to provide a little bit of a perspective from the philanthropy field. I represent WINGS, and I'll say a word about this global network, but we're also glad and proud to be part of the steering committee of the GPEDC. So climate is possibly and probably the biggest issue of our time, and this means that we need all hands on deck, and philanthropy has to do its share. Although its resources do not compare to governments or markets, it can actually play a critical role and a catalytic role because of the flexible nature of our resources, because of our independence, and also because of the proximity that we have with people on the ground and with the issues on the ground. We believe that we can leverage our influence as well to become bridge builders, which is absolutely critical because we need all sectors to collaborate, as none of us can solve the climate issue alone. So at WINGS, we bring together 200 philanthropic networks, funders, and other types of support organizations who are working to grow, to support, to strengthen the philanthropic sector around the world. And actually, we consider that given the scale of the climate issue and its implications on all aspects of life and all aspects of society, that it has become a sectoral issue for our field. So this is why we've decided to take action, and we have launched a global movement called Philanthropy for Climate. And through this movement that is led by more than 40 networks around the world, we are actually encouraging all kinds of philanthropic actors, regardless of their size, their mission, their scope, to engage and to act on climate. And I'm proud to announce that we already have 600 foundations from different parts of the world that have signed the international commitment for philanthropy on climate. So our sector is becoming more active. And in the last year, for instance, philanthropic giving to climate change has increased by 25%. But much more needs to be done, as only 2% of overall philanthropic giving is currently going to climate. So if we want philanthropy to play its role in enabling markets, governments, social movements, to bring about change at scale, we actually need a strong enabling environment for philanthropy to thrive, just as the broader civil society. And we also need that this enabling environment includes collaboration platforms and an ecosystem for collaboration between different players, both at the local level and at the global level. So linked to this point, I will ask the following question to the distinguished panel. and that is one of Busan's main principles is that development cooperation should ensure meaningful participation and recognize the diversity of views and complementarity of different actors. So how can participation mechanisms in climate adaptation finance decision-making processes be strengthened and effectively engage philanthropic actors, especially local philanthropic actors? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question. Let me see, maybe one of our ministers or both can share some thoughts in terms of how to bring philanthropy to the table to mobilize finance.
Well, I can come in if...
Thank you.
Yeah. No, wonderful. I mean, thank you very much. I mean, philanthropy has become an important part of the equation. And this whole concept of, de-risking private sector engagement, and as was mentioned by Benjamin, philanthropy has a more agile model to come into countries and help create the investable projects that are needed. The guidebook as well has a section on how philanthropy can, be integrated and be part of the climate finance landscape, and also a call for more coordination between MDBs and philanthropy, because there are synergies that can actually expedite and create more leveraging. That was also discussed earlier. So as we are bringing together stakeholders with the global partnership for effective development cooperation, I believe that also in the discussions going forward, countries in their stakeholder platforms are also including philanthropists, and I think this is going to be something very important and significant going forward. If I can just make 3 comments on a few of the questions that were mentioned earlier. I think South-South cooperation was not mentioned explicitly. There was the idea of more expertise sharing and more knowledge sharing, but with OECD and UNDP, there are several South-South initiatives, and this is very, very important because it can save a lot of time when it comes to trying to see how certain examples have worked in one country and can be replicated. The other issue is that every country today is updating or every 5 years there's an update of strategies with different development partners, and these updates include private sector and civil society. And as we are committed, all of us, to the Paris Agreement, usually the strategies include inclusive development, green and digital priorities. So again, trying to streamline these strategies and have a common language so that if a country is working with more than one development partner, we create complementarities between what each one of them is doing to be able to push the national goals with climate as we mentioned, being a centerpiece in the development objectives as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister?
I think one area where philanthropy could be helpful is paying insurance premiums for countries to them to access insurance in case of climate disasters. There's a lot of good data as to, in terms of rainfall pattern. For instance, Zimbabwe, we know exactly the rainfall pattern right across the country. We know which districts are vulnerable. So thinking about paying insurance premiums to ensure those districts will be very helpful. We did it one year. It worked very well. We got support from someone else. It was not a philanthropy organization, but we're able then to, because we got a drought on the back of that, we write about it, and then we're able to then access resources from the insurer and use those resources for cash transfers to the poor who were affected in that area. So I'm thinking that's one way for philanthropy to help paying for insurance premiums. If I can say one thing about our colleagues who said something about the just transition, that I also think that it would be helpful in cases where countries are transitioning, let's say, from coal to renewable energy, to set up some kind of, again, a social security fund partners should come together, create social security fund, again, for some kind of social security for the workers. They lose their jobs as we move away from coal to solar energy or to hydro. So that just transition, in my view, could be supported through social security funds, established by the partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you all for your wonderful questions. I would like to ask one last thing of you. You've been a wonderful panel, so I think everyone would be very excited to hear one last word or term. Whatever you think makes sense in terms of a last message coming from each one of you, so that the audience can take that with them after this wonderful session. So if I can start with you, Minister Nkube.
Governments should lead from the front when it comes to climate response.
Perfect, thank you. Ms. Moorhead?
Don't make SDG 13 the unlucky one.
Great. Mr. Osborne?
CSOs, as development actors in their own right, we also contribute in terms of achieving the ambitions, the climate ambitions that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Steiner?
Co-investment. I keep on having this sense that one part of the world thinks it is the only one who is putting money forward, namely the one that is being asked to put the 100 billion on the table. The developing world is already investing multiples in hundreds of billions. It's co-investment. It's not a kind of transfer from one group of countries to another. And out of that will come a much better capacity to deal with climate change.
Thank you very much. And finally, Minister Al-Mashat?
Just to echo what Akim mentioned and put it in the context of Egypt's country platform for the nexus of water, food, and energy, let's NOFI together. Let's move from pledges to implementation together.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I've learned a lot today, and I hope that you have also learned a lot. So let's please thank our wonderful panel. If you could stay, please, with us while we go through the closing, so we can have a picture of all of us at the end. But first of all, let me start closing by saying that I want to thank Sweden as the lead for this session, for putting together such an exciting program, and for inviting me. It has been a pleasure. It has been an honor. Also, I would like to invite all countries, all partners here today to reach out to us, to the NDC Partnership, should you have any questions or ideas about how we can help advance implementation of the NDCs, of the NAPs across the world. And I think this is perfect for me to say #ActionNow, because that's exactly what we do. And I will now thank you once again for being here today with us. Thank you also to the audience. That has been wonderful. And I would like to welcome on stage Ms. Diana Janse, who is the State Secretary for International Development Cooperation for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, to provide some closing remarks. Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. We meet in the midst of a perfect storm. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine not only threatens the entire rule-based international order, and thus all of it. The Russian aggression has also broad global implications, including on food security, on global financing, and on access to energy. This Kremlin-made disaster is taking place as climate change is accelerating. The accounts here today certainly underline that, and so does science. Climate change carries devastating consequences for people's livelihoods, access to water and food security. It also amplifies conflicts as competition over even more scarce resources harden. The most vulnerable, oftentimes with the smallest carbon footprints, are hardest hit. It is clear that we need to mobilize more financing for climate action, including towards adaptation. According to a recently released UNEP Adaptation Gap Report for 2022, adaptation costs in developing countries are 5 to 10 greater than current public adaptation financing flow. At the same time, we cannot afford but to also increase our focus on mitigation and emissions reduction. Sweden is internationally a leading donor of climate finance. We do more than our part, but we also intend to do even more. We're also working hard to reduce our own emissions. To increase volumes of financial flows towards climate actions and adaptation, our assistance needs to increasingly be used as a leverage to mobilize funding from other sources. ODA must be truly catalytical, mobilizing private capital and creating new green markets, showcasing the adaptation is well worth investments. Both planet and people are good investments. We must make full use of the synergies between climate finance, trade, and technical solutions. For instance, we can increasingly use innovative instruments such as guarantees, which can help us to de-risk investments in emerging markets, having the potential to unlock private sector investments at scale. We should promote innovation, untapping private sector ideas, initiatives, creativity, and free the entrepreneurial spirits so that they can come up with the next groundbreaking solution to global challenges. In addition to mobilizing larger quantities of finance, we need to enhance the quality and effectiveness of our support. Here we have an obligation to constantly improve, elaborate, and refine. Also, small adjustments count, just as changing the course a degree or two while flying will bring you to a completely different destination. Broad-based national ownership is key, as we heard here today. Governments have the main responsibility, which we also heard here today. Climate action should be mainstreamed into domestic budgeting, planning processes, and capacities in partner countries. Focus should be on building enabling environments, policies, legal frameworks, and institution processes. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in our session here today, we have explored how the principles for effective development cooperation can be applied on climate adaptation measures and how the global partnership can contribute to addressing existing challenges. We look forward to taking these conclusions forward in our role as incoming co-chair of the global partnership. As a slowing global economy meets rising needs as well as soaring costs, an even stronger focus on effectiveness, results, and transparency is now crucial. With the world facing multiple crises and with ODA being under pressure, development effectiveness is more important than ever. We need to do much more with less. We need to ensure that every contribution is well spent and has impact that is far longer than it takes spending it. It is our moral obligation, and it is in our self-interest to up the ante. That's what this meeting is all about. Thanks to all the excellent speakers, to the panelists, and our moderator here today. Thank you to the colleagues behind the scenes and everyone for joining here in person and virtually. We're all in this together. Thank you for your attention.